BCI View.
Now, these days, it sometimes feels like the hardest part about going to hospital is getting into a bed and then being able to stay in it. But for many people on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the problem is getting out of the bed you're in. There's new figures that show nationally healthy people on the NDIS who are in hospital are waiting an average 160 days to be discharged because of a lack of alternative accommodation and services. The federal NDIS Minister, Bill Shorten, has vowed to fix it.
The system's slow. There's not enough alternative housing for people to move into. But one thing's for sure, keeping profoundly disabled people in hospital because it's too hard to put them somewhere else is a lose-lose-lose situation. It varies between patients' needs, but it's about at least $2,000 a day, and in some cases can go to $3,500 a day to keep a profoundly disabled person in hospital when they're eligible for other accommodation. I was aware the previous government was slow, but I had no idea until we've got in and started examining the figures, talking to the states, talking to people in hospitals, talking to people with disabilities and their carers. I had no idea it was such a mess.
That is Federal NDIS Minister Bill Shorten. River Knight is a disability services advocate with Developing Australian Communities in Brisbane. River, thanks for joining us. Bill Shorten says he had no idea it was such a mess. I'm sure you did.
Hey, look, thank you so much for having me. I would say the situation with this housing crisis in terms of getting people out of hospital, I would say it's actually far worse than the statistics that Mr. Shorten's actually commenting on, because a lot of those statistics don't even start until you're enrolled into those processes. And the actual starting off, getting enrolled, getting approved, is actually one of the hardest parts of it. So I'd say we'd be even worse than some of the statistics that he's been describing. And the participants that I work with around Australia would probably say it's very frustrating and torturous living in a hospital for more than 12 months at times.
So he's saying there's 1,400 people or more than 1,400 people nationally in this position who are healthy but unable to be discharged from hospital because of that lack of services. What's the situation like on the Sunshine Coast?
So the Sunshine Coast is a very interesting mix because we have a smaller population, but when we compare it to other regions, even within Queensland, it's a little bit different. So on average, we estimate about 6% of people who are receiving NDIS funding would be eligible for what we call SDA housing, which is that modified housing to suit someone with a disability. We're currently sitting on about 3.6% of people who are eligible actually being approved for that around Australia. But up there in the Sunshine Coast, it's actually less than 2%. So it should be sitting at about 6%. Less than 2% of people in the Sunshine Coast are actually getting access to being approved in the first place, let alone being able to find actual places that they can move into. So right now in the Sunshine Coast, there's 44 unfinished what we call dwellings for people. We have 187 people who are needing those places to live, and right now we have 93 spots for them, so around half of what we actually do need, and we're about 8 to 9 years into the NDIS process. So right now we're actually got this crisis within that market, because the market is actually quite scary in terms of collapsing at some point. We are worried that the wrong houses are being built in the wrong places. And of course, when we're only looking at 6% of people on NDIS even being eligible probably for this type of housing, the 94% that won't be eligible still need affordable housing in Australia. So when we're talking about over 500,000 participants in Australia on NDIS needing housing, even this SDA process that we talk about for people needing modified housing doesn't cut it and doesn't even touch the majority of people with disability who are looking for affordable housing.
So you're saying 6% of people with a disability on the Sunshine Coast are eligible for modified housing, but only 2% are getting approved. That seems a strange gap, whether the housing availability is there or not, isn't it?
Well, one of the things that Mr. Shorten's really raised is that complexity in the system, and it's almost self-discriminating. So if I make the process so difficult to even navigate, I never get approved. If I make the process so long that my only option is to either keep going or give up and end up in aged care, I don't get approved. And then when I do get approved, I've had people who have been sitting in hospital. I met someone who was there for 6 months who was approved for this type of housing. And I asked them, why are you not looking at SDA housing? And they explained to me that their family, the nursing staff, the hospital staff, and the people they'd been talking to didn't even know what SDA housing was and hadn't even started the process of even looking.
So they thought that the only place for them was in a hospital bed.
Exactly. And those hospital beds are desperately needed. When we've got things like COVID on, the last place that you want to be when you've got breathing difficulties, if you're a person with a disability, is in hospital, given 60% of people that have passed away are people with disabilities. So we don't want to be in that hospital setting in the first place. And there's absolutely no reason for them to be in there. But the majority of those people that are looking for housing, they're not even looking for the SDA housing, which NDIS fund. They're also looking for just simple housing for themselves, which is public housing or private housing. And none of that's available because we don't have capacity in the public housing sector either, and we can't afford the public options that are out there, like private housing, private rental. It's difficult for the average person, let alone someone with a significant disability.
How much of this is not funding or organising the program, this SDA program for the NDIS sort of going back, and how much of it is just straight the housing crisis and the issues with construction right now?
Well, it's a fantastic market if you're looking for people to live in your houses and be secure and predictable. It's a fantastic market to get into because there are so many people desperately needing this housing option. But what we have is a financial disincentive. So if I'm in aged care and an aged care service loses a person with a disability that's living in aged care, they lose funding. So there's a disincentive for aged care to speed that process up. And there's also a disincentive for investors who are sold this SDA idea of only build high modified housing, which is the most expensive, but also the most lucrative. So if I'm thinking, well, if I get 5 people at $30,000 a head a year and squash them into a house, I'm going to make all this money. But the majority of people don't need the high physical modified housing type. They need the improved livability. They also don't want to live in group homes where we buy a tiny block, we get 5 bedrooms with 5 en suites, and we have no living room, no dining room, and we have 5 people in wheelchairs with staff squashed into a little house. So right now we have a lot of housing that's actually vacant in Brisbane and other areas. We have the same thing on the Sunshine Coast, but not as bad, but we will get there, where the houses that are built aren't livable. So as soon as other housing comes along, they are going to leave those houses. And we're going to end up with investors very angry because the housing and the building that's going on there doesn't actually fit what people need.
Why is that? Like, why would you be building houses that aren't going to be suitable for the people who are supposed to be living in them?
In a lot of ways, it's greed. It's absolute greed. It is, if I go to you as an investor and say, I can get you 5 bedrooms full of people that are all getting $30,000 or more a head every year, why would you, as an investor, if you are not ethical, invest in a house where maybe I can only have 1 or 2 people living in there, but at least they have a good setting and they have a good life. So we're now finding this marketing group emerge, which we call ethical SDA providers, who don't only do 4 and 5 bedroom houses, that actually do housing for people that are wanting to live on their own, that don't want to live in group homes, that want to live independently. So we're now finding the market's changing a little bit because we're filtering through and finding those providers that actually do care and want to provide a livable setting for people. And it is based on greed. In terms of what's happening in the sector right now. And we're seeing that with the statistics. So we're finding that out of all those houses, for example, on the Sunshine Coast, the 48 new builds that have just happened, more than half of those are the high physical support needs. And that's the minority of the housing that we actually need.
Bill Shorten says he's going to put resources into fixing this, but the issue here seems very similar to the broader issue with the housing crisis in general, which doesn't have easy solutions because of limits on the construction sector and housing prices and that kind of thing. Do you see a quick solution to this issue?
Well, right now we have to have a solution because we can't not have housing for people to live in because we can't have them in hospital. So right now, the easy solution is that people are putting them into aged care. That's not a sustainable solution. So we have a private sector, we have housing, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of houses being built around Australia right now. What we need those houses earmarked by investors or earmarked by the government to fund more public housing for people so that we can actually value people being in that sector. So what we do right now is we find those ethical providers, and there's some wonderful research done by Everhomes, a colleague of mine, Dan Ackford, who's the CEO there at Everhomes. They do a lot of research into that ethical housing around, spots that aren't the 5 people squashed into a house that's not livable. They look at the housing that the majority need, which is 1 and 2 occupant housing, where we don't need 24-hour one-on-one staff, but we need more houses that suit people who don't want to live in forced group home accommodation settings. So the immediate answer is that we have the houses there. We just need to help subsidise some of that housing to get people out of hospital, because living in hospitals is absolutely ridiculous in this day and age.
It is. River Knight, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.
All right, cheers. River Knight is a disability services advocate in Brisbane. It's just coming up to 8 minutes to 9.